Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the ThoughtStretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. This episode is a recorded conversation from a few weeks ago that took place as part of our ThoughtStretchers education community, and in it you'll hear registered participant questions that I was able to ask our guests. Those guests include three of the co-authors of an open access PDF book titled Developing Curriculum for Deep Thinking, The Knowledge Revival. That's available from Springer Briefs, and we'll put the link to that in the show notes. The co-authors that joined me were Paul Kirschner, who has been a guest on this podcast previously, Claudio Vanhees, and Daniel Muijs. Among the things that you'll hear us talk about are the three overarching principles of curriculum development. Those are content richness, coherence, and clarity. And of course, we touched on some other issues as well. I appreciate all three of them for joining us. And as you know, if you're a regular listener, I really enjoy these conversations where there are multiple voices and perspectives. I do highly recommend that you check out the book. And again, that will be in the show notes. It is an open access book. You can buy it in hard copy from Amazon, but that's about $55, so definitely look into getting the free PDF copy. There is another podcast that we published, by the way, which was an AI-generated summary and then discussion of this open access book. That is titled Developing Curriculum for Deep Thinking, The Knowledge Revival, and it was published on January 22nd, 2025. We'll put that in the show notes. As always, I'd like to remind you that our website, wegrowteachers.com, includes this podcast, all of our blog content, as well as our professional development and professional learning. I like to say that our professional learning is always through the lens of inquiry, but we always want to make sure that we are helping teachers understand the importance of cognitive science and things like the science of learning concepts like scaffolding and assessment and knowledge. So those kinds of things are always embedded in our work in meaningful ways. Our PBL Grow 25 event, which will be held in Louisville, Kentucky in June, is open for early bird registration through the end of the month. So if you're interested in that, please do check that out. And we also have just released a ThoughtStretchers Guide to PBL free PDF that you can find in the blog content if you're interested in learning more about project-based learning. That is a curated collection of blog writings available on our website, but organized in a way that we hope is helpful for those of you who are interested in project-based learning and things like knowledge-rich inquiry teaching. Again, that's available on our website. It is a free download, and you can find that by Googling ThoughtStretchers Education Guide to Project-Based Learning or going to one of our blog pieces, and you'll see an image that you can click on and get there on the right side of any of our blog pieces. As always, feel free to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org if you have comments, questions, ideas, or concerns. And without further ado, here is that conversation about knowledge, curriculum, and deep thinking. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm with ThoughtStretchers Education. I'm here with Paul Kirschner, Claudio Vanhees. I think yes. I'm close to that. And then this is the toughest one of them for me, Daniel Muijs. Probably not that close, but he's going to do a better job of pronouncing it. We were joking about how hard it is for an American dialect to get some of the European names. But we're going to talk about the book that is an open access book and was released, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 weeks ago now, Developing Curriculum for Deep Thinking, The Knowledge Revival. Paul has been a guest on the podcast before, but Claudio and Daniel have not. Appreciate their joining us. And those of you who are also joining and RSVP'd, I will mention that we have a Q&A function. You should be able to see it along the bottom, somewhere in the bottom of the Google Meet. And I would really encourage you to submit questions there. And what we can do is from there, harvest those questions and try to ask Daniel, Claudio, and Paul to respond to some of those things. We're going to try to wrap up around the top of the hour. But again, please do submit some questions there so we can get those. I'm sure they will be much better than the ones that I might pose. So want to start with some basic introductions. We'll go up what's on the top of my screen here, go left to right. We'll start with Paul and then Claudio and Daniel. So just a brief introduction of who you are, your work, and that kind of thing. And then we'll kind of get into the meat of the book.
Okay, if I'm the first one, my name is Paul Kirschner. In American, it's Paul Kirschner. I was born and bred in the Bronx, but have lived in the Netherlands the past 52 years. I had a bachelor in psychology. I was a teacher in the United States, came to Europe, did quite a lot of things, got my master's and my PhD in educational psychology, and I've been studying how people learn and how teachers teach and how to make that more effective, efficient, and enjoyable. Now since like 1978, so that means I've been doing it a heck of a long time. I'm now an emeritus professor of educational psychology at the Open University of the Netherlands, and I'm a visiting professor actively at the Thomas More University of Applied Sciences, where also Claudio works and Daniel used to work.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Claudio?
Yes, I'm Claudio Vanhees. You pronounced it quite well. I work in Belgium for the Center of Expertise in Education and Learning, as Paul mentioned, where I work as a senior researcher. I have a PhD in educational studies, and I used to be a language teacher myself as well for almost 10 years. I worked on both sides of the linguistic border in Belgium, in different institutions in higher education, secondary education. I also worked 2 years in Mexico and the Instituto Tecnológico de Estudios de Monterrey, also known as ITESM, which is a bit shorter. And then I went back to Belgium, and I've been working for 4 years at the center, where I conduct research, and I specialize in reading comprehension and curriculum studies. I'm particularly interested in the combination of both, of course, as we elaborated also in the book.
Great. All right. Thank you. Daniel?
I'm Daniel Muijs, and I am a Professor of Education and Head of the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University, Belfast in Northern Ireland. I've previously worked at a number of universities across England, Belgium, the Netherlands, and I also worked for the English Inspectorate Ofsted.
All right.
Well, educational effectiveness.
Great. So the book, again, is open access, and hopefully folks have had a chance to take a look at it. I looked back through it a second time today in preparation here, Developing Curriculum for Deep Thinking, the Knowledge Revival. There's a number of co-authors, some of whom I'm quite familiar with and have been on the podcast here and chatting with me before, some of whom I'm not. But I'm really curious how this came together and how you all sort of got, I guess, came up with the text and having so many different voices. What was that process like, and why did it feel like it was, I guess, necessary or helpful to have so many voices? So maybe Daniel, since you were the last to speak, we'll let you answer that, or anybody, if you have any particular insight.
I can make a start on it. So firstly, I think from my point of view, certainly it was a painless process, and that is largely because though there are a lot of co-authors, we are very much in line in terms of our thinking around curriculum. So it felt very much like a process in which we were sort of supplementing each other, coming maybe from slightly different angles. So, for example, the learning and psychology angle, which Paul is obviously expert in, or more the sociological angle, or the angle around sort of the cultural value of knowledge-rich curriculum. So really, we were all bringing kind of complementary knowledge to the table, and I think in that way it worked really well. It's worth saying that the kind of initiative certainly came from the colleagues from Thomas More, who started off.
Yeah, it began as it's a very organic process. We started out very small. It started out as kind of like working towards a working paper, because we felt at Thomas More University of Applied Sciences, at the Expertise Center, Education and Learning, we felt that there was a need to be outspoken about the necessity of having background knowledge, of having knowledge in order to learn. I know it's this way in the United States. It was also this way in Europe, maybe since the 90s in Europe, that knowledge, the pendulum swung to, we don't need knowledge anymore. We have to deal with 21st century skills, and you can Google anything, so knowledge isn't necessary. So we thought that there needed to be a strong, I won't even call it backlash, a strong voice, trying to make it understandable for people why knowledge is necessary. So we started out small, just for a white paper, a paper to spread amongst teachers and also amongst policymakers, making a plea for more knowledge in the curriculum, to go and get away from this idea of general skills. And it organically grew because, as Daniel said, a couple of people at the center, coming from different ideas, expanded it to talk not only about the cognitive psychological part, but also about the sociological, the democratic aspects of the need for knowledge, talking in terms of E.D. Hirsch. And it grew and grew. And at a certain point, we thought, well, we need to ask people what they think about it. So we thought of who are the thought leaders here. So we came up with Dan Willingham, Dylan William, those types of people, John Hattie, and they read it and they liked it and came up with the idea from, why don't we publish it as a book? And so that was the next step. And we worked together, put our shoulders on it and did that, and went to Springer and said, would you like to publish it? And they said yes. And we said, we'd like it to be open access. And they said no. And we said, how about if we give you a lot of money to make it open access? And they said yes. And they didn't really do it from the goodness of their hearts. And that's the way it happened. So it's a book that you can buy. It's a really nice little book, but it's also something that we thought the world needed. So it's now open access to everyone. And Claudio is in charge of getting it translated into Spanish. So maybe
yes, so we hope, yeah.
This.
And a Dutch translation is also on the way, which is more for, of course, our local crowd, local teachers in Belgium and the Netherlands, but also very important, of course. And then the Spanish translation is already on the way as well. So it's getting quite international, even more international than it already was in English, of course. I think Paul and Daniel really summarized it well. It's a bit like the whole concept of a knowledge-rich curriculum. And in the book, we also started with a strong knowledge base, and then we went inserting more and more knowledge, turning it into a really dense book full of knowledge, which was well sequenced and at least we hope, well sequenced and really contributing to more insights for a broad readership. Yeah, that was the idea.
It's been downloaded more than 130,000 times.
Well, it's one of the things that I like about it is that it's not short, but it's not long, right? It's digestible, and I think that's important because sometimes I'm looking over here to my right and holding up, speaking of John Hattie, his latest book, Visible Learning, the sequel, some light reading of what, hundreds and hundreds of pages, right? It can be a little bit much. For those of you who are listening and attending, just in case you are wondering where you can ask the questions, it should be, I think, down in the bottom right corner. There's some shapes: a triangle, square, and a circle. And I think if you click on that, you'll see the Q&A option to add questions. And I obviously encourage you to do that. One thing that I noticed here, I was reading the foreword from E.D. Hirsch, who certainly some people disagree with. I find him to be certainly resonant. I think that we have overlooked in progressive education some of the things that are important about knowledge. And as Paul, you and I have talked before, I tend to think of myself more as an inquiry advocate, but I also want to make sure and disabuse any educators that think knowledge is not important to sort of correct that. One thing that E.D. Hirsch wrote, I think it's the first sentence here. It's this book's written by experts from 8 nations, explains why imparting specific shared knowledge in early grades is important for achieving high levels of citizen competence and so on and so forth. Why the focus on early grades as opposed to sort of all the way through the, here in the States, we call it K-12?
I'll take a stab at that, if I may, from my other co-authors. Have you ever heard of anything called the Matthew effect?
I have not.
Okay. The Matthew effect comes from sociology, and it was originally applied in teaching and learning to reading. And that was that a small gap when you come in, if you don't watch out in knowledge, will increasingly get larger, will diverge. Matthew effect comes from the Bible, and to put it as in one sentence, it's the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So a child that comes in with a deficit in knowledge, and that's not only knowledge, not just being able to read, but just knowledge to understand the world around herself or himself, and also to understand what she or he is reading. If you don't do something to close that knowledge gap as quickly as possible, that gap will get bigger and bigger and bigger until it reaches the point that the divergence is so great that it can never converge again. Okay? Now, that's the whole idea behind beginning as early as possible. Those students, those learners who are disadvantaged and come into preschool at age 2 or kindergarten at age 4 or 5, the difference between what they know and what their better situated peers know is already there and will continue to grow. So if you want that not to be the case, if you're really into equity, and I know in the United States that's become a dirty word, but if you're really into equity, then your job as a school, as a teacher, as a nation, is to close that gap as quickly as you can. And the only way to do that, we think, is with good pedagogy, primarily explicit instruction, within a very knowledge-rich curriculum, so that the children who don't come home and talk to their parents about what was on the news or those types of things get the knowledge they need to learn well. Claudio, Daniel, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think an important part is indeed that that knowledge is well sequenced. So that way, as some specialists in the UK sometimes say, as for example Christine Council says, then what you do as a teacher is a promise to the next teacher. So the idea is that you actually create the prior knowledge that the next teacher can build upon. So that way, if it's carefully selected, then you know very well what you're teaching, what the teacher before you has been teaching, and what the next one will be teaching. So that way, the knowledge can also become interconnected, and you have a very good idea of the prior knowledge that all your students have. So that way, you can create convergent. You can differentiate in a convergent way, and no longer create larger and larger gaps, but try to narrow them as much as possible, in a sense that you try to teach your lessons in such a way that all students can achieve common goals that you set forward, and you don't have to lower your standards because you have to differentiate so much that the achievement gaps, as the achievement gaps become too large between different groups. That's a bit the general idea, I guess.
Well, one thing that I noticed that you, or that I say you all, the collective group, seem to make a priority is some clarity around the pendulum, and I think, Paul, you mentioned that earlier. Like we see this pendulum shift back and forth in education, in the discussion around education, from progressive education to something that's more traditional or something like that. And you mentioned sort of two, I guess, sort of radical or extreme positions. And what I'm understanding is that you're really aiming for, in this particular piece of work, something that is a more measured, middle ground is maybe not quite the right way to describe it, but something that is not something at either end, but is more measured. And I certainly am on board with that. I'm wondering maybe, Daniel, if there's something you might be able to add, or of course, any of you, that might sort of speak to how you see those pendulum swings and what maybe is a better sort of middle ground.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I obviously clearly agree that there's this issue of pendulum swings in education. We all have seen that. However, I don't think I'd entirely agree with saying that what we are trying to do is sort of find the middle ground between the sort of pendulum. I think actually what we're trying to do is to do something, and when I talk about us, I talk more generally about people advocating for a knowledge-rich curriculum. It's actually trying to do something a bit different, both from the kind of what Michael Young would call Future One scenario, which is kind of a fact-based knowledge curriculum, very much focused on memorizing often disparate facts. So I'm struggling to think of any dates from American history because I don't know much about it, but say 1302 Battle of the Golden Spurs.
I'll help you with 1776. The Revolutionary War, 1789 was the Constitution, War of 1812, Yellow Journal. Okay.
So and kind of obviously as part of a reaction against that, you've got the kind of competency and skills-based approach that Paul was mentioning earlier. Now, what we are not saying is we want to go back to that old approach. Rather, we want to use a knowledge-rich approach, but where knowledge is defined as, in the way that Claudio was mentioning, this kind of progressive build-up, this ability to develop links between new knowledge and old knowledge, to develop richer schemes in your long-term memory, and essentially it is about developing knowledge for understanding and developing context. So that's kind of what Michael Young calls a future three. So rather than say, okay, you have a pendulum swing and we're swinging back to the middle or whatever, I would more say, maybe draw on the kind of Hegelian or Marxist kind of view of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And the synthesis is not the middle between the thesis and the antithesis, it's something new. And I think that's what we are trying to say here, doing something new, but something that is based on what we know is the importance of knowledge, but what we also know is the importance of connected knowledge, knowledge that is conceptual, and so on.
And coherent.
Yes, yes.
As opposed to disparate facts. Some people, I mean, I'm used to the caricatures, and I'm not saying anybody here is they're making the caricatures, but making the caricature, for example, the straw man of what explicit instruction is, that it's standing in front of a room of 600 people and lecturing for an hour. Okay, that's not explicit instruction, that's lecturing. Yeah. So what you often hear is what Daniel was talking about, that Future One, the straw man of a knowledge-rich or content-rich curriculum is just a bunch or bag of facts that have to be memorized and be able to be vomited up when necessary. It's actually the opposite. It's highly contextualized, highly coherent, and it's not this straw man bunch of facts that you often hear the opponents. And for me, it's absurd. I can't conceive of there being an opponent to having children gain knowledge.
Yeah, it's kind of the distinction between what you might call an information-rich curriculum, where you just throw facts at children, and then this is really a knowledge-rich curriculum where you have interconnected knowledge, which is well chosen, well sequenced, and really balanced, which is a very, very different approach, of course, and that's what we advocate for. So it has really nothing to do with loosely connected, interconnected facts that you just stack on top of each other, but it's really the interconnectedness which gives it its strength. I think, yeah.
So again, I would encourage those of you who have joined us to add some questions here. Otherwise, you're going to be subject to my questions, which may not be the ones you want to be hearing them talk about. So you talk about the straw man and the caricature and finding, a path forward that is more productive. And, as I said earlier, and Paul and I have argued is maybe not the right word, but talked a bit about locked horns on the role of inquiry, right? And one thing that I wonder about is, how do we find a way forward? Because what it seems to me that there is, in one end of the spectrum, what I might say is the more inquiry, constructivist, progressive, however you want to characterize that, and overlooking and leaving out of the discussion of the role of knowledge and appropriate scaffolding and explicit instruction, those kinds of things. You'll be heartened to know I just talked with Howard Gardner, who made that point elegantly and said, progressive educators have been too idealistic, and we or they have overlooked some of those things as well. But on the other end, what I hear often and see often is a pushing of anything and everything being really so focused on the importance of explicit or direct instruction, usually small d and I, direct instruction, and a sort of denigration or
but Drew, this book has nothing to do with what we would call in the Netherlands and Belgium didactics. I think you call pedagogy, how it's taught.
Right.
We're talking about the content, and I don't want this discussion drawn into the age-old dichotomy of inquiry versus explicit instruction. There's nothing in this book talking about what pedagogy should be used. This book is about the need for a knowledge-rich curriculum, because even if you want to do inquiry, you can't inquire if you have no knowledge. Yeah. So the idea behind it is we need a knowledge-rich curriculum. So I'm locking horns with you again, but here to get you away from falling into that dichotomy, because the book is not about that. It's
No,
not
and
a book about pedagogy. It's not a book about how you should teach. It's about the necessity of children gaining the knowledge they need to be good students, good citizens, good workers, good people. Yeah, that's what the book is about. And so please, let's not talk about different pedagogical approaches.
No, and I appreciate that, and was going to mention that the book doesn't get into the pedagogy, but certainly you talk about the problem solving, and certainly inquiry is a part of that, and so I think it's as we think about knowledge and the relationship with problem solving and some of those skills, maybe one or all of you can kind of talk about how you see those being related, interrelated. What are the things that that are important in getting some of those skills that may be often thought of as not domain specific, but as research sort of alludes to and shows that it is domain specific. So what are some of those things that how would you describe the relationship of knowledge and skills like a critical thinking, problem solving, some might say inquiry, and things like that?
Okay, I might just come into that one. So the first thing that is worth saying is that there's sometimes a view that if you are kind of talking about an knowledge curriculum, that means that you think that skills aren't important. That is obviously not correct. Those skills that you're talking about, like problem solving, critical thinking would be another one, that are absolutely important. And certainly what you want to get to is that children and young people develop those kind of skills. However, what we are seeing is that in contrast, the sort of view that actually those kind of skills are kind of generic, almost tricks that you sort of can learn and then apply to whatever you encounter, that actually they are linked to particular disciplinary forms of thinking, that they are built on knowledge, and that actually in pretty much any skill you can think of, there is a knowledge component. I can give you maybe some examples of that. One of the most straightforward to think about is maybe the skill of kind of critical thinking. And the bottom line is you have to think critically about something, and to do that effectively, you need to know something about that thing, because otherwise what you get is, you could say, criticality without the thinking. And the issue is that is something that you do actually see quite a lot in society at the moment. And I think that is in part a result of us going maybe a little bit wrong in education. So if you look at something like, okay, QAnon theories, I don't care if I am offending somebody, but that's obviously absolute nonsense. However, to know that that's nonsense, you need some knowledge about politics, you need some knowledge about history, etc. If you don't have that knowledge, it's easy to fall into those kind of traps. And even if you think of things that are almost often seen as very kind of natural skills, say for example, playing soccer, to use the American terms. That's often seen, okay, that's a physical thing, so that's skills-based. Actually, even in something like that, there is a strong knowledge component. Firstly, you need to know a little bit about the rules of the game. Otherwise, if, say, as a European, I go to a school in America and say, oh, let's go and play football, they're going to pick the ball up with their hands, and obviously that's not allowed under the rules. But also there are things like, where do I actually, what part of my foot do I actually kick the ball with to get the most effective shot? It's not what kids naturally do, which is with their toes. So those are bits of knowledge that you teach. So skills really, in my view, matter, but you need the kind of underpinning knowledge and also the knowledge and the link to the subjects to actually effectively develop them.
Yeah, well, we've got a couple questions coming in, so I'm going to honor those. But before we do, Paul, you'll be happy to know that as I coach soccer, as you might say football, recently, I was giving some very explicit instruction and had a little conflict with one of my fellow coaches who wanted to say, let's see if they could just figure it out. So, you know, I'm not always... So let's move on from that. So Michael is asking, I'm just going to read it and hopefully this makes sense. So coherent, as he puts in quote, knowledge seems very simple to me. There must be more to it than I'm thinking. Can you paint the picture of a counterexample? What makes a curriculum or lesson not coherent in a problematic way? He puts in parentheses there. So maybe Claudio, you can take that.
Yeah, I might definitely give it a go. Yeah, I think there are several elements here. If we think of coherence, you have vertical coherence, so from one year to the next year, but also horizontal coherence, so across subjects. And at the same time, ideally, you also have spiral coherence, where certain elements come back after a while, so that you give them enough time to forget about something you taught them, then so you can then actually retrieve it again, which makes you memorize it longer. But at the same time, if we think of a counterexample, a wonderful counterexample I often see in some of the textbooks of my own son, who is now in the third grade. Are especially reading comprehension lessons. Then they get a few texts. One is about, I don't know, beetles and bugs. The next text is about vacuum cleaning. And then they have just another text about something completely different as well. No coherence at all. And it is, for many children, very difficult to grasp what is said in the text, and then often, they have to apply some sort of reading strategy, main idea, to produce the main idea. But often, what you're actually measuring is how much specific domain knowledge and vocabulary do these children have related to the topics you're teaching. So if you just present them with a set of different texts each time, and they're not connected to other domains or other subjects, whereas at the same time they're learning about the world in another subject, but the texts are completely unrelated. And then you ask the teacher, but maybe you might connect those insights to the text you're actually teaching the children when reading. Oh no, but those are two completely separate things. No, that's a different subject. At the same time, it would definitely be much easier to create coherence if you connect both. That's also what we find in much of the empirical evidence, that actually those subjects such as history, geography, arts, etc., can really build vocabulary and domain knowledge and knowledge of the world in children, which can really help to facilitate their reading comprehension. But then, of course, you also present them with coherent text sets, which are actually connected to the things you're teaching them, and no texts that are about one topic one day, and next day about something completely different. And then they say, "Oh, the children can't read well." But what are you actually measuring? That's the question, of course. So that's one example. I think others can be given.
Yeah, it requires you to think further than your own class or only 1 year, because what you want is in a period, if you're talking about K-12, that's 13 years, if I have it correctly, K and then 1 through 12. We actually have 2 Ks, so it's 14 years. What you want to constantly build on it, and what we see is it's kind of like atomistic. There's no reason why a certain thing is taught in English in this year we're talking about literature, or that year. It's kind of like a hodgepodge. If you build it up in a coherent way, then you build it up so that if you're reading about the Great Gatsby, you should be reading at the same time you're talking about what's happening in history in the 20s and 30s, or if you're talking about the Dust Bowl and things like that. But if you're talking about Shakespeare, you need to be talking about another time. So that means you have to have history, politics, literature, art, and look at them and see them as a coherent whole, because it's hard to interpret a piece of literature if you don't understand the time in which it was written or what it's being written about. And what we normally see, going back to the questioner, is curricula that are not coherent. They are just bunches of facts for which there's no reason that a certain thing is taught at a certain time within a certain subject area. And that's over the years, but within the years. Claudio was really clear about, for example, within the years, that what you're doing in your reading text in the 5th grade should have something to do with what you're doing also if you're talking about civics in the 5th grade, or if you're talking about the sciences, the natural sciences in the 5th grade. Have those texts and knowledge be related to each other so that you have a context for understanding it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take a look at really successful knowledge-rich curricula, we actually notice that they're highly interconnected. So we included some of the examples from other countries in our book as well. And if you take a closer look at them, when you really study them, which is one of the things we do at our center, then you can really see how the knowledge they selected is. How they select the knowledge is one thing, but then they really connect it in a way that, for example, in year 1, what you see in history really forms a solid foundation for what you teach in geography in year 3. So you have all these interconnections, then you get this interwoven knowledge. So in that way, you also get coherence, which is a difficult thing to do, but that's what makes it so. That's what makes it so rich in.
It allows the learner also to create more knowledge-rich, both broad and deep schemas in the long-term memory, because they have more different things to connect new knowledge to.
Right. As a former history teacher, one of the things that I've often advocated for is teaching history in the context of government class because of that, right? It has more context and those kinds of things. Is there anything important to say here about this coherence concept as it relates to cognitive load theory, or is there?
I mean, if you want, I could bring it in. I prefer not to.
Okay.
But cognitive load theory says very simply, you shouldn't overload working memory.
Right.
The broader and deeper the schemas, or schemata as I call them, in your long-term memory means that the less chance that something that you are teaching today will be seen as a new and discrete knowledge element, so you can bring that which is in your long-term memory into your working memory, so that you can better make use of it. And in cognitive load terms, I would say, well, then you're offloading your working memory and making what you have in your long-term memory to create less cognitive load on your working memory. But what you're actually saying, if you want to do it as simply as possible, is that you're helping them create broad and deep schemata in their long-term memory, in which they have an anchor or what's an upstock in English?
Yes, or how would you
a
say?
hat rack or whatever to hang this new
Right.
knowledge on. That's what you're trying to do from day one.
So we have another question here from Eric, and Daniel, maybe this is something that I can address to you, since you mentioned QAnon, and I'm right with you, because this is a question about the political dimension. So the question is, could you talk a bit about the political dimension of choosing what knowledge should be included in a curriculum? As I see it, there's a need for a political dimension since some knowledge is politically defined. However, that is, of course, a worry if we have dysfunctional political leadership / landscape.
Okay, yeah, that I think is a very good point. And of course, when you look at sort of a knowledge-rich curriculum, you're going to have some significant differences between different subjects. So you have subjects which are kind of naturally more hierarchical in nature, and on which there tends to be more of a consensus around what the key concepts are. And mathematics is obviously kind of the archetypal example of that. Obviously, that's not necessarily true for subjects that are less clearly hierarchical in nature. And there you are going to have to make choices. And you mentioned you were a history person, and history is obviously a prime example of exactly that.
Right.
And yes, so if you look at kind of the different theorists writing about the knowledge-rich curriculum, you can kind of see some different viewpoints on that. So I mentioned Michael Young earlier, and he would very much go to the kind of disciplines and say, okay, what are the key concepts in the disciplines as they exist in higher education, for example? Of course, that doesn't fully solve that problem, because it is not the case that we in higher education are fully in agreement in all subjects about what those key concepts are. Then you've got somebody like E.D. Hirsch, who again we've mentioned earlier, who talks kind of about core knowledge as kind of a shared set of things that people within a particular society need to know. Of course, again, that doesn't fully solve the problem, and that's for two reasons. One is, of course, that what is the shared knowledge that everybody in a society needs to know? That's not a static thing, that is a dynamic and changing thing. Also because, of course, what disciplinary knowledge is changes. But also, of course, one criticism that I would have of Hirsch's work is that it assumes that the kind of what he calls the cultural capital, so that is the knowledge, you could say, of the upper classes, is itself relatively static. Whereas actually, if you look back to the work of Bourdieu, where that concept comes from, it's actually the case that it's a little bit of a moving target. So if everybody starts to know a lot about, I don't know, another example, Bourdieu, and obviously was writing a long time ago, would say classical music, for example, then okay, the ruling classes may find something else to distinguish themselves for. So yes, absolutely, there are political decisions that need to be made, and that requires a bit of societal debate. Now, who makes those decisions is, of course, one of the big questions in education. And again, different countries have kind of different approaches to that, some which are based more on consensus, and some which are maybe more top-down, or some which are more localized. So to give, and all of those have their advantages and disadvantages. So the top-down system has the advantages that things happen relatively quickly. And I have worked many years in England, and England is a prime example of kind of top-down curriculum reform, which has quickly introduced changes. The problem with that, of course, is exactly the one that came out in the question. What if you have a particularly unhelpful government? Do you want to say the new Education Minister J.D. Vance deciding what is in your curriculum, my view would be no. So there are advantages and disadvantages. On the other side, when you look at a kind of consensus system, and Paul will know that well because that's what they do in the Netherlands, they can talk for 20 years about a reform and have more talks and more talks and more talks, and never anything happens.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, and then the third kind of approach is a more localized one, and I'm work now in Northern Ireland, and those of you who know a little bit about the history of Northern Ireland will know that it is a country which has had kind of 25 years of civil war between those largely Protestant people who want to remain part of the United Kingdom and those largely Catholic background people who want to become part of a United Ireland. And it would be very hard to develop a national view of history that would be accepted by both those different communities. So there you have to say, okay, there has to be some localization of those frameworks in order to get societal buy-in to your curriculum. So absolutely there are decisions. Now, let me, I'm sorry for this long answer, but let me now just say what happens if you don't have that knowledge specified in your curriculum. And you say, like in Scotland, for example, you have a very competency-based curriculum, also like we have in Northern Ireland. What happens then actually is not that what is taught is just those generic skills. What actually happened is that what is taught is either pretty random, because teachers do need content to even teach those sort of generic skills. So either they will choose that relatively randomly and get those kind of incoherent curricula that Claudio was referring to earlier, or those gaps in specificity in the curriculum will be filled in by other things, like the exams. So then you see in many countries that what is actually in the tests becomes the curriculum. And that is very unhelpful, because what you then typically get, certainly if you look at time, is very narrow curriculum where you're just focusing on those things that are in the tests. That's what you see in Northern Ireland, for example, at the moment, where there is a very low specified competency-based curriculum. What do they actually teach in the schools? Well, what is in the exams? And therefore, what you actually just get is loads and loads of teaching to the test, frankly. So also not choosing knowledge is not a neutral decision. That also ends up being a political decision as well, because there will still be knowledge coming in, but it just won't be coherent. It won't be well worked out.
Yeah. So one of the things that is written about in the book, in a part that says knowledge matters, a sociological perspective, which I think is kind of in this realm, right? We're talking about postmodernism as part of this problem. One of the things that I continue to harp on and think is a real issue in America, I'm curious how you three see it from an international perspective, is that there's a very grave misunderstanding of you could call it Enlightenment liberalism, intellectual liberalism, the ways in which we construct knowledge and hold knowledge, of course being provisional, but that we have had talk about pendulum swings, pendulum swings from one end where we have lived experience and, these people have the knowledge. And then now we have a president here in the States who says he has the truth and he has the knowledge. And neither of those, I think, are aligned with what I would say is Enlightenment liberalism. And so we have a problem, a political problem, insofar as we aren't allowing the process to work we have varying political groups seizing control of what should or should not be taught in the States here. Are you seeing similar things outside of the States?
I would say, well, the level of kind of polarization that obviously has characterized policy in the US recently is one that is harder to not that it doesn't exist, but it's hard to operationalize in systems where you have a more proportional electoral system, and therefore rather than having one party in power, you will have typically a coalition consisting of 2, 3, 4 parties. Inevitably then there will be some differences. However, I mean, it's fair to say that also in Europe we are certainly seeing increasing polarization in politics. That is certainly an issue. But coming back, linking that to curriculum, what I would say is that one of the challenges there that we have is that if you want kind of a healthy public debate in a democracy, you do need some kind of shared understandings on which to base that debate. And therefore you need some shared knowledge, some shared facts that you agree on. And one of the problems we are seeing with the polarization is that there's almost a tendency to say there isn't any real reality or real knowledge. Knowledge is what I think it is. Reality is what I think it is. And therefore you get groups very much speaking completely next to each other, and you never really get that debate because there is not a kind of shared base in knowledge that allows us to disagree with each other in a rational way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. And, you know, I'll make a plug here for our work on what I call objective pluralism, but those are weeds that don't necessarily want to get into. We do have another follow-up question or another question from Eric. And again, any of the three of you feel free to take this. So Eric says, sorry to bring in the dichotomy of teaching methods, in parentheses, please ignore this as you wish. However, would you agree that an inquiry method, a la Freire, at least, is a way to solve the problem of what knowledge to choose, not saying it is a good solution, just an explanation of why it is attractive to some?
I
mean, does one of my co-hosts want to take this one?
I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. No, because I will probably end up making caricatures and misinforming people. So I'll duck that question. I'll leave it to Claudio and you to talk about Paulo Freire and whether or not his way of thinking about teaching is a solution to the curriculum problem.
Claudio, Daniel, either of you want to touch that? And feel free to pass on it.
I think Daniel was actually going to start, but I
yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So yeah, so a couple of things there. I mean, I think I'm going to split your question up into kind of two parts, which one is kind of Paulo Freire and his approach to kind of pedagogy of press, emancipatory teaching, etc. And on the other hand, inquiry learning, because I don't think they are entirely the same thing. So
I would agree very wholeheartedly.
Yeah. So when you look at Freire, of course, Freire is somebody, well, I don't say that, but there's a very distinct purpose to his approach, which is this view of emancipation. And actually, my view is when you read Freire, there is quite a strong knowledge element to that, because there is that idea of kind of emancipatory knowledge that allows the learner to understand better their social situation and therefore understand how they can take action to improve that that situation in a kind of revolutionary way. So I actually don't necessarily see a massive divide between Freirean approaches and knowledge-rich approaches. And again, I mean, there are different forms of knowledge that you can put into knowledge-rich.
Yeah.
So
I may add just one thing. There's
Yeah,
another
okay.
educational reformer for what's called Jena Plan education, and that was Peter Peterson. And oh no, I want to talk about. Sorry, I want to go to Freinet. Sorry, for this one, Freinet education. That's for me a perfect example. What they said is that we want to change the context and not the knowledge. And what I mean by that is they saw the textbooks coming from Paris as being something which reinforces the political order and the social order, because Pierre went to the patisserie to buy a croissant, yeah, and he said, well, it's important to be able to deal with all of those things, but you're in a mine working community, and you don't go to the patisserie to buy a croissant, you go to the baker to get a French bread. And so they said, we don't use the textbooks coming from Paris, but we do teach the same things, but within the context of our own. And the teachers there were taught to make their own text materials to teach those things. So what they did there was, yes, math is math, biology is biology, but the context of it is the local context that the children could relate to. And that has nothing to do with the chosen pedagogy, but it does make the curriculum and the contextualization of what you learn very local.
Which is quite the opposite to knowledge-rich approaches such as opening worlds that actively try to open children's world, whereas what Paul described indeed leads to the opposite in the practice. So
exactly, but that's the choice. It was an answer to, I think it was Eric's question. I didn't want to do with Freire, but I was triggered by Daniel and went into Freinet, Celestine Freinet. But you were going to make a second point, and then I'm going to go to bed.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, okay, to go back to this issue of inquiry learning. What obviously, I think what we would say is that in order to ensure, and we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the importance of kind of knowledge in terms of equity and in terms of kind of leveling the playing field. In order to do that, you are going to have to instruct kids and provide them with that knowledge, because otherwise what you risk doing is that you rely more strongly on the knowledge that they already have or that they have from the home, and therefore you risk exacerbating the inequities. That doesn't mean, of course, to say that there is no place for inquiry approaches in a knowledge-rich curriculum, as long as you have enough knowledge to actually sensibly do the inquiry. And there is some interesting research on that. One of the earlier studies, evaluations of the core knowledge curriculum done by Sam Stringfield and colleagues, for example, showed that in the core knowledge schools, there was a lot more use of inquiry-based methods than the evaluators were expecting. Why? I mean, that wouldn't, it's not what you would hypothesize, and it's probably not what Hirsch would hypothesize either, but it's interesting that you see that finding happening. Similarly, I've looked at some data comparing the curricula in Northern Ireland and England with the pedagogical approaches of teachers, and whereas there's a big difference in the curricula, the difference in the actual pedagogical approach is much smaller. So though you would expect a relationship there, it's not always as strong as you would expect it to be.
Well, we're at just past the top of the hour here, and I appreciate the questions, and looks like Eric has got a comment there if you want to read that. And trying to get us away from the dichotomous thinking and the arguments and find, productive ways forward is certainly a goal of mine. I appreciate the three of you and all of you for joining. This will be published as a podcast, obviously, and you may see some video clips out there. But Daniel, Claudio, Paul, thank you again so much. Anything you want to say before we sign off? I know Paul has been up for about 7 or 8 days, I think, and or might feel that way, and he's ready to go to bed. But I'll give you all any last words before we sign off in case you want to.
I enjoyed it, and it was a nice salon. It was a lot less horn locking than the last time we met Drew. So I don't know if that's thanks to you, thanks to me, or thanks to us.
Well, again, thank you all very much, and we'll sign off on that note. And maybe next time it'll be some horn locking, but let's see. Thank you.
Bye.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.